Hi everybody, thanks so much for joining us today for our second webinar in our People Lab playlist series. And today's webinar is all about measuring and maintaining employee engagement. Okay, so a big part of the measurement challenge comes back to the issue of definition. As we talked about on our last webinar, there is no universal accepted definition of employee engagement. There are some 52 different definitions and counting, which of course makes measurement really challenging. How can we measure something that we can't accurately define? So you need to be really clear on how you're going to define employee engagement, and the way that you define it will then help you to understand how it is you're going to measure it. And I've put a couple of definitions from David McLeod and Lord Curry down there around this idea of kind of knowing it when you're seeing it and smelling it. And that's all good, and we all kind of buy into that, but it doesn't really help us to measure it. So we have to get really specific on our measurement so that we can, on our definition, so that we can actually measure it effectively. Now, those of you who joined us for our last webinar will know that I did a little bit of survey bashing. I'm not anti-employee engagement surveys. I think they're incredibly useful. But they're only useful as a foundation for what happens afterwards. They're only useful as some insight in terms of what we need to take action upon. As I said previously, it's only a small part of the jigsaw, and there are a whole range of different survey tools out there. And again, it comes back to what is it you're actually trying to measure here. So some of the tools look at the levels of engagement as a scale or percentage that allows you to benchmark. Some of them identify key drivers via things like regression analysis. Some of them look at the preconditions of engagement. Some of them look at the outcomes of engagement, and some of them look at attitudes. So there's a whole different way of measuring engagement, and you need to be really clear on what is going to be useful for your company, what's going to be useful to help you drive action as a result of the survey data that you get out of this. And as most of you will be aware, there is a whole industry around employee engagement surveys, and every survey provider will tell you that they have the definitive way of measuring employee engagement. I just put a few of the most infamous and well-known engagement survey providers up here just to give you a flavour of what's out there. So Towers Perrin, for example, look at the extent to which people put discretionary effort into their work. Gallup, the Q12, many of you will be familiar with that. They look at involvement and enthusiasm for work. Hewitt, well known for the Say, Stay, Strive model. They look at intellectual and emotional commitment to an organisation. Simpson Consulting look at knowing what to do at work and wanting to do it. And Hay Group look at stimulating employees' enthusiasm for their work and directing it to organisational success. So lots of very well respected survey providers out there with a whole heap of fantastic in-depth global data and insight. So it's just a matter of figuring out which one is going to give you the insight that you need. But coming back to the point I made on the last webinar, which is this idea of the survey being only one part of a much larger jigsaw. And I just wanted to kind of reinforce this, the survey health warning. So lots of organisations embark on running an employee engagement survey, and with all best intentions, they run a survey, often action plan in a spreadsheet, and very often we find that the results go into a black hole, and not a lot really comes of this. And I think it's that it's time for a new approach. It's time to look at this a different way. And a good question to ask yourself is, how much budget have you got for the survey versus how much budget have you got for what happens after the survey? And I think that will give you a really good indication of, are you focusing on the right things? So I think it's time for a new approach, an approach where we see the survey as one part of the jigsaw, but not the end itself. And I also think it's time to say, actually, let's not just ask what's wrong and what's not working, but let's start to ask much more strength-based questions around what does good look like and what was happening when people were highly engaged. I'm not going to go into this in any depth on this webinar, but if you're interested in this approach, then do check out the first webinar we ran, which really took a much more in-depth approach at what this, in-depth look at what this new approach looks like. and how you can take a strength-based approach to employee engagement and your survey as well. So I'd like to focus now on the big picture, and there's some really interesting developments happening out there at kind of government level and much more macro level, which I think we're starting to see flow through to organisations, and I wanted to share some of that with you now. So a look at the big picture, sustainability. What's really interesting is that since 1970, the UK's GDP has doubled, and yet people's satisfaction with life has hardly changed. And 81% of Britons believe the government should prioritise creating happiness rather than wealth. I think it's really interesting in terms of employee engagement to think about this. And a quote there from Robert Kennedy saying, gross national product measures everything except that makes life worthwhile. So although we're seeing these amazing rises in GDP, okay, it's been a bit of a bumpy ride over the past few years, but in general the trend is on the up. What we see is that this hasn't played through in terms of increases in our well-being as a nation. And I'd like to draw your attention to something that's run by the New Economics Foundation called National Accounts of Wellbeing. They've been involved with some really amazing, groundbreaking work that looks at new ways of assessing our progress as a society. And they have been kind of influencing policy at a macro level in terms of this work. And they're saying that actually there's more to life than just creating wealth, and there's more to life than just simple satisfaction. There are lots of other dimensions such as our personal well-being, our feelings, our psychological resources. And I think I highly recommend that you check out their website. I put the address at the bottom there, and have a look at the sorts of work they're doing, because I think there's a lot of learning that you can take from this work at a macro level and apply to an organisational level in terms of organisations understanding that it's not just about bottom line, that actually how people feel is a big part of the picture as well. And I've included on there a screen grab from the NEF website that shows the well-being of various nations in the Eurozone there, some that have taken part, some that haven't. And you can look at the different kinds of criteria that they use. So this one's showing, for example, overall well-being. You can click on things like personal well-being, vitality, resilience, and you get kind of different colours depending on the results of the survey for those nations. And it's quite interesting to have a bit of a play around on this and see how well these different countries are doing. And you can also look at things like gender, age, and economic status as well to say, how does that impact overall levels of well-being. So I'd really urge you to go and have a look at this and have a play with this, because some really interesting work going on in NEF in this area. And of course, many of you will be familiar with the UK's Office of National Statistics Happiness Survey. There was a lot in the press when this launched, and I think actually it came from a really great place, a motivation to say it's not just about examining our wealth, but also to say actually how happy are we as a nation. And the questions included things like, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? To what extent do you feel things you do in life are worthwhile? How happy did you feel yesterday? How anxious did you feel yesterday? And I think it's a real step in the right direction that governments are taking this seriously and saying we need to figure out how, what our well-being is like. And I think that, we're really seeing that also reflected in organisations that, employee engagement is absolutely on the up. And we're saying it's not just about the bottom line, it's about how engaged our employees are and their overall well-being. And again, what I've done is included a few charts here. You'll see one come up now, which show you the different scores called subjective well-being, which is a term you use in positive psychology. And they look at happiness by different areas of the UK, so you can have a play around with that if you're interested. They also look at other areas as well. So on this slide, we're looking at worthwhileness, again by county and local authority, so you can have a play around with this and see the differences between these different measures essentially. So they look at satisfaction, worthwhileness, happiness and anxiety. and quite interesting to have a play with this and see which areas of the UK are doing well and which areas are doing not so well. I think the one that stands out most on all of them is Rutland is obviously a good place to live. So anyone who's listening from Rutland, let us know if it's really that great there. I've passed through it a few times. I think it's quite nice. But yeah, well worth having a look. And the point I'm trying to make really is that we're not just measuring engagement, well-being, subjective well-being at an organisational level. It's something that's being looked at a government macro level as well. And the final slide I want to show you here is just looking at satisfaction. So these are the areas you have high satisfaction with life. So interesting to see that many of us are measuring different facets of engagement and well-being. So you might be sat there thinking, oh, this is all really interesting, Emma, but so what? What's this got to do with employee engagement? Well, I think the first point is to say we don't operate in a vacuum. What's happening at organisational level is also happening at a more societal level and a government level. And I think there are lessons we can learn from this work. You know, how are government and think tanks measuring this stuff? So how are New Economics Foundation measuring well-being, and how the government measuring well-being? And we can learn a lot of lessons from that. I also think it demonstrates that governments are taking this seriously, and this thinking is starting to filter through to organisations, i.e. focusing on subjective well-being and taking much more of a strength-based approach, which is really interesting. And at the very least, you know, if you're interested, you could benchmark your sort of employee engagement results with some of this data that's out there and say, you know, how well do you perform against your local results? So I think that could be quite interesting to look at from that point of view as well. Okay, so I'm going to take it from the kind of the bigger picture to get you thinking about the impact that you have. And this is something that as you know, I have a sort of social science background, very keen on research and evaluation and demonstrating return on investment. And I think it's really critical to the professionalism of employee engagement and being taken seriously that we're able to say to our stakeholders, this is the value we're adding and this is the impact we have. And I'm just going to share with you a few sort of key nuggets that I've picked up along the way that will help you do that. Okay, so when it comes to measuring impact, why bother? Well, I think I've sort of already talked about that. It's really critical for us to be taken seriously, to be able to demonstrate that we're not doing something that's kind of fluffy and nice to have. We absolutely have an impact on the business. And in terms of evaluation, the way I look at it is that it operates on 3 levels: process, impact and outcome. So process level measurement really assesses assessment via the audience perception. So the classic is the happy sheet at the end of the event. Impact measures the immediate effects of the engagement activity, and the outcome measures the longer term impact on things like organisational outcomes such as attrition, or it might be well-being, or it might be even customer satisfaction. And I think it's useful to think about the impact you have at these 3 levels. And what can you do to measure your impact at those 3 levels. In terms of methodology, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this, but I thought I'd just stick this slide in there as a kind of a bit of a reinforcement. So I've put some words in here around quantitative and qualitative methodology in terms of measurement. So quantitative is about kind of volume and about being able to generalise to the wider population, usually a larger sample, and you tend to gather data through things like questionnaires, online questionnaires, telephone, that type of thing. And qualitative is much more about smaller samples and gaining a really deep understanding of what's happening in your organisation. It's really useful to have qualitative and quantitative, to use them together. But of course, you can't generalise qualitative findings to the wider population, which is why I tend to like to use both types of methodology when I'm evaluating. So using the engagement curve to measure impact. So I think this is a really useful tool to use to demonstrate your progress in terms of the impact you're having in an organisation. So I tend to design questions around these different stages of the engagement curve. So first of all, I'll ask questions around awareness. So do you know about it? Were you aware of it? Then I'll ask questions around things like understanding. So do you understand it? And in fact, a better question to ask is, could you explain whatever it is you're evaluating to a friend or colleague? Through to kind of positive perception and adoption. So, for example, questions like, do you think the direction we're taking is right for the company? Do you see these behaviours happening around you at management level or at your level? If you're interested in using the engagement curve, take a look at our British Gas case study, which shows you how to use this to evaluate. So moving on then, what does success look like? Again, I've kind of tried to share with you my sort of top tips for measurement here. And some of the critical success factors that we tend to look at in our world are things like clarity of purpose, creating line of sight, the role I play, so helping employees make the connection between what they do and the bigger picture, and then actual behaviour change. And what I've done there in that sort of slide there is to give you some examples of some of the questions that you could use to evaluate how well you're doing in that area. So for example, clarity of purpose, you might say, I understand why, blah, blah, blah. Line of sight, you might ask people about the role that they're playing. The role I play, you might ask people about knowing how they contribute. And then behaviours, things like asking them if they see the right behaviours happening around them are useful ways to evaluate this. So moving on to maintaining engagement. Essentially, one of the key questions I ask here is to get people to think about the employee life cycle. So every touch point that the employee has in your organisation, from attraction to recruitment, onboarding, induction, the way that their performance managed, the way they're communicated with, the way they're appraised, the way they're trained, you get the picture. And a really useful exercise is to get your HR team to list out all those touch points and really kind of figure out the current reality for those and the desired future state. And to really ask yourself the question, are your touch points supporting engagement and facilitating engagement, or are they sabotaging employee engagement? And the results I think you'll find will be really interesting if you do that piece of analysis to give you an insight as to whether you are supporting engagement or not. So what we tend to find when we do this activity with teams is that there are some obvious touch points that are really not helping you in terms of employee engagement. So for example, you can have a fantastic recruitment process and get people really excited about joining the organisation and a fantastic employer brand, but then you may find that you have a somewhat lacking onboarding or induction process that kind of really lets people down once they walk through the door. And inevitably, when I've done this with teams in the past, there will be some very clear points in terms of in maintaining employee engagement where, you know, that there are some real bottlenecks and some real areas where employee engagement is definitely not being supported, is definitely being sabotaged. And so it's a really useful exercise to do, and it gives you some really, really clear insight in terms of what it is you need to do to help maintain that employee engagement throughout the career or throughout the employee life cycle. So getting towards the end of the webinar now, I'm just going to finish it off by saying thank you very much for joining us today. Hope you found it useful. Do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you with either ideas for how we can improve future webinars, or any comments, any questions you have would be fantastic. I mentioned the British Gas case study in terms of a really good case study to see how you can use measurement against the engagement curve. It's on our website, www.peoplelab.co.uk, so check it out and have a look at that. Download the case study if you think it would be useful. And thank you very much for joining us, and please do enjoy the rest of your day and hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.